Good afternoon. On behalf of the Dominican Sisters of Sparkhill, I'm happy to welcome you to this presentation on our Dominican sister, St. Catherine of Siena. The title of this series, as you may know by now, is The Saints and Saintly Dominicans, comes from the tradition our congregation once had of reading a passage from the 1931 book by the Dominican friar Thomas à Kempis Riley. We read it at supper each evening. Like that little book, this series seeks to give a glimpse into the lives of various figures from our church's rich tradition, figures the church has recognized as holy, men and women, religious and lay, many of them Dominicans. Today, we are going to consider an extraordinary member of the Dominican family, St. Catherine of Siena. Her feast day, April 29th, is the anniversary of her death in 1380. A lay Dominican, Catherine was such a powerhouse of God's grace that she has since been named not only saint, but also patron saint of Rome, of Italy, and of Europe. And along with Teresa of Avila, she became one of the first two women to be recognized as a doctor of the church in 1970. Catherine is so significant to the Dominican order that when she was named doctor of the church, the master of the order, Aniceto Fernandez, echoed his predecessor, Michael Brown, saying that Catherine was the second founder of the order. Fernandez also sorry, I'm having a little technical problem here. The slide isn't moving. There we go. Fernandez also declared that into Catherine the whole soul of Dominic passed. We find expressions of the order's high esteem for Catherine in paintings where she is portrayed with Dominic at significant moments. For example, in St. Catherine's Chapel in Santa Sabina in Rome, we see Sassoferrato's famous Madonna of the Rosary, where both Dominic and Catherine received the Rosary from the Virgin, despite the fact that Catherine was born more than 100 years after the death of Dominic. So how are we to understand who Catherine was with such a history? There's another example of her being pictured with Dominic receiving the Rosary. Who was this deeply contemplative, yet politically active woman who was absolutely fearless in addressing the evils and injustices in the church and world of her day? A good word to describe Catherine's time would be calamitous, or even cataclysmic, a period of tremendous upheaval and social instability. The 100 Years' War was raging. The deconstruction of the Holy Roman Empire continued. There were peasant uprisings and popular revolts in Europe. Tremendous rivalry and fighting among the Italian city-states. Rome was in the midst of a civil war. Christianity was divided by the Western Schism, two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon. The Black Death ravaged Europe. In 1348, the year after Catherine's birth, 30 to 50% of Siena's population died from the bubonic plague. And the threat of famine was always, these were her times. I think that we can say and make an argument that the 14th century was a time not unlike our own. And that insight begs the question, what would Catherine do here and now? What might we be called to be doing that same thing? Catherine of Siena is a figure who can sometimes seem to be somewhat unreal, a kind of superwoman who was an extraordinary, perhaps even severe mystical presence in a chaotic period of history, an outspoken person who was challenging church leaders and high-ranking civil authorities, popes, archbishops, princes, queens. Today, I'd like to focus on Catherine as our sister and a model for Dominican women today. To do that, I suggest we abandon any of our preconceived ideas about Catherine and try to see her as someone who arose from an ordinary life. Look at her as the girl next door. Imagine that you live in Siena, a neighbor down the street from her family. Her mother, Lapa, has been one of your closest friends since childhood. What would it have been like to accompany Lapa as her youngest child, Caterina, grows up, a child whom Lapa slowly recognizes to be truly extraordinary and about whom she is consistently surprised? Who is this young woman we know as Catherine of Siena, and what might she have to say to us? Before we can really hear her message, we need to understand who she was. You'll notice the artist here, Platillanelli. She was a Dominican nun, a cloistered nun in Florence, the first female Florentine artist of record. So we have a few of her paintings that we'll be using today. So Caterina de Benincasa was born on March 25th, 1347, in the artisan district of Fontebrande, in the thriving city of Siena, just a year before the Black Death struck Europe. In the early 14th century, Siena was a thriving cosmopolitan center of commerce and culture. Catherine lived in a home situated in the shadow of the Basilica of San Domenico and the magnificent Fonte Branda, which supplied natural spring water to that entire area. Still is doing that today. The Benincasa home was above their family business. They lived there and they had a dye shop at the end of the Vicolo di Territorio, which is, you notice the sign over the door. Sponsa Christi Caterina Domus, House of Catherine, Spouse of Christ. The family was part of the rising merchant class. Translate that as well-to-do. Catherine's parents were Mona Lapa Piagenti. Mona means my lady, showing some of her aristocratic background. She was the daughter of a local poet. And Jacopo de Benincasa, I'm sorry, I'm having a tremendous problem getting these slides to move. There we go. I'm sorry. He was a prominent merchant and cloth dyer who ran his enterprise with the help of his sons. They wanted a large family to help with the business. Catherine and her twin sister Giovanna were Lapa's 23rd and 24th of 25 children. Giovanna died shortly after birth, as did the 25th and last child the following year, leaving Catherine as the youngest and much beloved child in a loving family. At least half of Catherine's 24 siblings did not survive infancy. In those days, it was common for women to give birth to a great number of offspring, as there was also an equally high infant mortality rate. Lapa lived to the age of 80, quite remarkable in that day. Much of what we know about Catherine comes to us because her short life was chronicled by her devoted mother, Lapa. Catherine was, by all accounts, a very lively, energetic, affectionate, precocious, charismatic, and headstrong child who grew into a spontaneous, fiery, and fearless woman. Catherine grew up surrounded by a loving extended family with married siblings, their spouses, and their children. She had numerous playmates among her nieces and nephews, many of whom lived in the Benincasa home. She once confided to a friend about her little nieces and nephews, "If decency allowed, I would never stop kissing them." She was given the nickname Euphrosyne, which means joy, because of her joyful disposition and her deep devotion to God. Even as a young child, Catherine devoted much time to prayer. At the age of 5, she used to climb the stairs in her home, praying the Ave Maria on each step. Her mother said at times she seemed to fly up without touching the steps. Recognizing her desire to pray, her parents even curtained off an alcove in the family dining room where she could pray undisturbed. At the age of 6, when she and her brother Stefano were returning home from a visit to their married sister Bonaventura, Catherine had the first of many visions. She was walking along the Costone Ridge, overlooking the Fonte Branda, that monumental fountain where she would have drawn water so often, and perhaps the source of some of her imagery. Catherine saw the Lord Jesus suspended in the air above the roof of San Domenico. Jesus seemed like an emperor seated on a throne, clad in pontifical vestments and tiara, surrounded by Saints Peter, Paul, and John. The Lord smiled at her and blessed her with the sign of the cross. I won't make note of the size of Stefano, who was her older brother, but he looked smaller there. I think the artist wanted Catherine to stand out. The vision is depicted in a lovely outdoor shrine located at that spot. Following this extraordinary experience, Catherine was convinced that God had chosen her and that Christ had asked her to be his spouse. From that moment, she devoted herself to Christ, drawn deeply into a life of childhood prayer, penance, and devotion. And thus began Catherine's love story. With the spiritual focus the vision had given her, she now had only one concern: how to please her beloved. Within a year, she made a personal vow to give her whole life to God in perpetual virginity. Though only 7, it seems that she was aware of what that commitment meant. Now we'll fast forward to preteen Catherine at the age of 12. As a good mother, Lapa was seeking a good match for Catherine. With Bonaventura, Catherine's sister, her favorite sister, sorry. Catherine's mother, Lapa, convinced Catherine that marriage was a good thing for her, a proper thing for a young girl of her age. The two of them pressured Catherine to wear finer clothes and to pay more attention to her hair in order to be noticed by a desirable potential husband. Catherine did try, but in 1362, Bonaventura died in childbirth, and Catherine was told that she would be marrying her sister's widower. Determined to keep her vow of virginity, Catherine cut her hair short on the advice of her cousin, the Dominican friar. I'm sorry. On the advice of her cousin, Dominican friar Thomas de la Fonte, her first spiritual confidant, Lapa was furious. As a punishment and as an incentive to change her mind, Lapa gave Catherine many of the most difficult chores in their large household and deprived her of the large alcove, the small alcove where she used to retire to pray. However, the result was not what Lapa expected. After about a year, Catherine wore down the patience of her mother by being equally stubborn. She served the family by doing the most menial chores with great joy, kindness, and patience. She later wrote that during those years when she was deprived of solitude, she discovered that she could build a little cell in her soul where at any moment, no matter what she was involved in, God's presence could be found. One day she announced to the entire family that she was willing to be their servant for the rest of her life, but she would never consent to marriage because she had taken the Lord Jesus as her spouse. During that same time, one day her father saw Catherine at prayer. Jacopo saw the Holy Spirit hovering over Catherine and realized that her piety was authentic, that he and Lapa should stop trying to hinder her. So Jacopo told the family not to disturb Catherine or to try to dissuade her from the way of life she had chosen, because it was not a childish whim, but a response to the call from God. So after the long battle of wills, Catherine's father and later her mother accepted her decision not to marry. Her father freed her from the punitive kitchen duties imposed by Lapa and gave her a small room for her to be able to withdraw to pray. It became the cell of her writings that she refers to often. In 1363, just 3 days after her 16th birthday, Catherine was admitted to the Dominican Order of the Montellate, a group of older lay women, almost all widows, who were bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and were dedicated to prayer and charitable works. Their habit was a long penitential dress or cloak that covered them from head to toe, hence the name Montellate. Her habit was initially reserved for widows who wanted to remain so for their entire lives as a penitential act. But Catherine was neither married nor a widow. They had been hesitant to admit such a girl, but Catherine was determined. She finally convinced her mother, Lapa, to put pressure on the prioress to accept her daughter. Catherine became the first virgin dressed in the Montellate. There's an altarpiece that depicts Catherine with 4 Montellate. Catherine was clothed in the habit in the Basilica of San Domenico, in the Cappella delle Volte, the chapel of the vaulted ceiling, an area in the rear of the church at the end of the nave where the Montellate often gathered for prayer. Catherine went to this chapel daily to pray and was frequently seized by ecstasies, during which she used to lean against the octagonal pillar that still stands on the open side of the chapel. The Andrea Vanni painting of Catherine and a devotee. It's the only painting created while she was still alive, and therefore it's considered to be a truthful representation of her features. Now a Montellate, Catherine began a 3-year period of intense prayer and solitude, scarcely leaving her room, her cell, except to go to San Domenico for prayer, mass, and to speak to her confessor. She spent almost all of her time in this tiny space under the stairs that led up to the family's kitchen. The room has been preserved, as has the stone that Catherine used as a headrest, along with many other things. Some of them are her walking stick, her lantern, her flask of smelling salts, all of which were used when she traveled through the city to care for the sick. On Shrove Tuesday in 1366, at the age of 19, after 3 years of prayer and visions, Catherine was praying in her cell when she had a mystical vision of Christ, Our Lady, and the hosts of heaven, with King David playing on the harp. The Blessed Virgin lifted Catherine's hand up gently and raised it to Christ, who then placed a ring on her finger, espousing himself to her in a mystical marriage. After this experience, Christ asked Catherine to leave her cell, to engage with the world outside, to serve her neighbor in love. He assured her with the words, "I have no intention of parting you for myself, but rather of making sure to bind you to me all the closer by the bond of your love for your neighbor. Remember that I laid down 2 commandments of love of me and love of your neighbor. On these 2 commandments, as I myself bore witness, depend the law and the prophets. It is the justice of these 2 commandments that I want you to fulfill. On 2 feet, you must walk my way. On 2 wings, you must fly to heaven. Love of God, love of Christ, and love of neighbor." And eagerly embraced a more active ministry, especially among the sick, the imprisoned, and the most needy in Siena. Even though she longed to stay secluded, her love for her bridegroom was so great that she threw herself into the new tasks, not only with great energy, but with great humility. She began by devoting herself to nursing the sick in the various city hospitals, especially those afflicted with the most repulsive diseases, the ones no one wanted to care for example, leprosy and the bubonic plague. She ministered in the nearby hospital of Santa Maria della Scala, one of Europe's oldest hospitals still operating, situated in front of the Duomo, Siena's magnificent cathedral. This large complex in the heart of the city takes its name from the steps, Scala, leading up to the cathedral. One of Europe's oldest hospitals, it was organized to care for pilgrims, to assist the poor, and to provide for abandoned children. Within the hospital, there is a small oratory underground, marking the place where Catherine nursed the sick. This oratory of St. Catherine of the Night is the room where, when it became too late to return home, she would fall asleep exhausted after long hours of nursing the sick and needy. It's no surprise that Catherine is a patron saint of nurses. The fame of Catherine's outstanding spiritual gifts started to spread beyond Siena. Her advice was sought by people from far and wide. It wasn't long before she was being asked to facilitate the conversion of notorious sinners or to restore peace between warring families and individuals. By 1370, Catherine was becoming deeply involved in controversies that were plaguing the church and state. She dictated her letters of reply to her friends because she had not learned to write. She sent hundreds of letters to a very diverse group, members of the nobility and prisoners, royalty and prostitutes, intimate friends and persons she had never met, religious, clerics, even the Pope himself. 382 of her letters have been preserved. It's actually in a letter to one of her scribes, Stefano Macconi, that we find one of her oft-quoted exhortations. If you are who you should be, you will set all of Italy ablaze. We say all the world today. This period of intense activity, however, did not take away from her intimacy with God. She often spoke with Christ in visions. Her great ecstasies have been documented in her writings and captured in art, such as Il Soddomo's frescoes in San Domenico in Siena. And in the chapel of St. Catherine and Santa Sabina, Odazi's ceiling frescoes, including the exchange of her heart with Christ and a vision of Christ asking her to choose between a golden crown, which would ensure riches in her earthly life, or the crown of thorns, which would guarantee her glory in heaven. She chose the crown of thorns, which is why she is often depicted wearing that crown. But we shouldn't assume that Catherine's life was one of isolation, or that the extraordinary nature of mystical experiences made her difficult to relate to. On the contrary, the joy in her heart found exuberant expression in her words and countenance. We have many affectionate testimonies of her magnetic, lovable personality. A group of followers began to gather around Catherine. The group became known as the Catrinati, Catherine's people. Attracted by her work and her passion and enthusiasm, clergy, friars, and young people quickly joined her. The group soon included men and women, members of religious orders, and laypersons of various social levels. Although Catherine was barely out of her teens, and most of them were older than she was, her followers clearly recognized her holiness and sought to follow her into a new kind of life. She became a spiritual director to them, and they began to call her Mama. Timothy Radcliffe notes that the Catrinati seemed to have been a community of lively young people who gathered to enjoy each other's company and to talk of God. For Catherine believed that their mutual friendship was an opportunity to bring each other to birth in the gentle presence of God. Timothy also notes that they had a playful sense of humor. They called her our sweetest Mama, and they gave her each other silly nicknames such as Giovanna Pazza, crazy Giovanna, and Stolta Cecca, foolish Cecca. According to Blessed Raymond of Capua, God had endowed Catherine with the most ready tongue, a charisma of utterance adapted to every circumstance, so that her words burnt like a torch, and none who ever heard her could escape being touched. He reported that she had a mysterious attraction which drew souls to God and made them take delight in God's self. She drove out despondency from the hearts of any who shared her company, and banished dejection of spirit and all feelings of depression, bringing in instead a peace of soul so deep that those who experienced it did not know themselves. Two of her disciples, Anastasio de Montaltino and Giacomo da Pecora, wrote their impressions of her in verse while she was still living. Their words paint a portrait of how irresistible her power was of attraction to these young people. They wrote, "She draws souls as the magnet draws iron, always kind, always full of compassion and kindness. She keeps her eyes turned heavenward, bathed in pious tears, while she is ready to pour out her heart's blood of the call of charity. She is ever joyful and smiling, and counts her own sufferings as nothing. Though she always has the sharp knife in her side, yet she makes light of it with her spouse and recreates herself cheerfully, praying the while for those who have need of pardon. From the crown of her head to the sole of her feet, she is full of Christ and sings his glory day and night. And when she names the sweet name of Mary, she seems wholly united to her." Of course, there were some critics who thought Catherine should not be trusted, to the point that in 1374, the General Chapter of Dominicans summoned her to Florence to study her orthodoxy. Upon examination, she was judged to be without error and was allowed to continue her activities. A learned and humble friar, Raymond of Capua, was assigned to be her spiritual guide and confessor. A future master of the order, Raymond also became her spiritual son, her biographer, and her closest friend and confidant. Leaving Florence, she went back to Siena, where the Black Plague had returned. She cured the infected and healed those who lay dying of the disease, including both her confessor Raymond and Matteo de Ceni, a holy man and friend of both Raymond and Catherine. Once the plague had ceased, she traveled for the first time to the Dominican monastery in Montepulciano to venerate the uncorrupted body of its foundress, Blessed Agnes. It was a place of pilgrimage. Agnes was one of the very first Dominican women that was being honored and venerated as holy. When Catherine arrived at the monastery, she and her fellow pilgrims made their way to the body, which was preserved incorrupt. Catherine knelt down to kiss the saint's feet, but before she could bow low enough, one foot raised itself towards Catherine's face, perhaps to signal Catherine's holiness. The ever-practical Raymond of Capua suggests that Agnes raised only one foot to preempt any skeptics. He wrote, "If she had raised up both feet together, some people might have thought that this had happened in a merely natural way, considering that the body was stiff and lifeless, as if some pressure had chanced to come upon its upper part and cause the lower extremities to rise." So we feel this really did happen because of the way it was documented in Raymond's remarks. In 1375, she traveled to Pisa on a mission of peace to dissuade local authorities from joining the anti-papal forces. While in Pisa, Catherine fell into ecstasy and received the gift of an invisible stigmata, which appeared on her body physically only after her death. She saw a vision of the Lord on a crucifix and rays extended from Jesus' body to hers, piercing her through. Catherine's union with Christ made her truly free. Her caring and deep compassion for the sick, the dying, and those in sin made her willing to go outside the boundaries, to get involved in ways which could be easily misunderstood, especially in the politically charged environment of her day. On her return to Siena, she risked being labeled as a traitor when she acted to bring Christ's peace to Niccolo di Toldo, a Perugian who was arrested in Siena and condemned to death on the suspicion of plotting against Siena's position on the church. He was bitter and resentful and had no remorse for any of his actions. Catherine's goal was to reconcile Niccolo to God before his approaching death. She managed to break through his anger and convince him to go to confession and mass. At Niccolo's request, she was there to console him at his execution. Placed under a papal interdict, the Florentines asked Catherine to intercede for them at Avignon. She traveled to Avignon as an ambassador for the Republic of Florence, but also to plead with the Pope to return to Rome. There she met with Gregory XI, who had already received fiery letters from her regarding his activities. Raymond of Capua accompanied her and served as an intermediary as Catherine reprimanded the Pope. She finally convinced the Pope, and Gregory XI returned to Rome in January of 1377. In the summer of 1377, while she was on a mission of peace and evangelization within the castles of Rocca d'Orcio, she wrote to Raymond to tell him that she had been given a vision called the Dialogue, that's what she called it, that abundant light of truth, which would eventually become the substance of what she called her book. She sent him a summary of the revelation in a long letter in her own hand, having miraculously learned how to write while she was there. In 1378, she was sent to Florence by Pope Gregory in another attempt to make peace. There, she barely escaped being killed in a riot, but at last a treaty of peace between Florence and the Pope was signed. She returned to Siena in late summer and began dictating her theological masterpiece, which took the form of a dialogue between the Father in heaven and the human soul, represented by Catherine herself. Her book, as she called it, is perhaps her greatest gift to the Church. Entitled The Dialogue of Divine Providence, much of it recorded by secretaries because Catherine composed it during prayer in times of ecstasy. She completed it in October of 1378. It is not written in the form of a treatise. Rather, it takes the form of questions that Catherine asks the Lord and the responses he gives. In addition to this great spiritual masterpiece, 382 of her letters and 26 of her prayers have also survived. In September 1378, the French cardinals turned against Pope Urban VI and Rome's lack of culture. They really didn't like it in Rome. They much preferred the elegant lifestyle in Avignon. So they returned to Avignon, where they elected an anti-pope, Clement VII, breaking the unity of the Church. This was the beginning of the Western Schism. Catherine fully supported the Roman claimant, Urban VI. Summoned by Urban, she left Siena in November to take up residence in Rome. She was with her followers, the Catrinati, in a house near the Dominican Church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva. Throughout 1379, Catherine sent letters and messengers from Rome to all parts of the Christian world to convince ecclesiastical and civil authorities that Urban's election must be accepted as legitimate. She even appeased the Romans who had been rising against the Pope. Her yearning for peaceful unity of the Church was like a fire consuming her. Her efforts and prayers to God for peace and unity in the Church never ceased. But Catherine's health was deteriorating badly. In January of 1380, she became worse each day, no longer able to eat or drink, even as she maintained her extraordinary letter-writing activity. Despite her exhaustion, for as long as she was able, she would drag herself from her home to Old St. Peter's, which was up between the 4th and the 15th century. It was a mile away from where she lived, and she went there to spend the whole day near the entrance, fasting and praying. On the facade opposite the central entrance, Giotto's massive mosaic of the Navicella, a little boat with the apostles in it, the mystical ship representing the Church. We don't have a photograph of the mosaic, but this is a painting that someone had done of it before it was destroyed. Its importance can't be understated of this mosaic. Today, a new mosaic of the Navicella holds a place of honor in the narthex of St. Peter's Basilica. But Catherine, it was the old St. Peter's when she was there. One day when she was praying there, Catherine not only saw, but felt the ship, the bark of St. Peter, laid on her shoulders. Feeling its crushing weight, she collapsed. For her, it symbolized that her struggle to reform the Church was crushing her, and she understood it to mean that she was to give her life for the church. From that moment, her bodily strength began to deteriorate visibly. She suffered a mysterious agony for 3 months and was unable to leave her bed. Catherine is often depicted as holding the Navicella, the ship of the church. And speaking about his icon of Catherine, Franciscan artist Robert Lentz tells us he placed on her shoulder not a little fishing boat, but what would have been the equivalent of an ocean liner for her century. He placed not a simple cross marking it as the Church of Christ, but a sail with the papal insignia, the coat of arms representing the institutional church, the Church of the Popes, was crushing her. Lentz suggests that it's a symbol of so many people. He mentions, for example, Dorothy Day. People who have struggled to remain faithful to the church, to purify the church, to be faithful to the gospel, even as they struggle against the corruption and injustices. By February 1380, Catherine had lost the use of her legs. No longer able to go out, she prayed from her bed while continuing to dictate letters to civil and church leaders, begging them to be reconciled to the true Pope, Urban VI. Practically from her deathbed, she saw her final political goal accomplished, the reconciliation of Pope Urban VI with the Roman Republic. To her faithful family, whom she summoned to her bedside, she said, "Do not be cast down, my darling children, at my passing. Rather share with me in my joy and congratulate me, for now the time has come for me to rest in the peaceful sea, the eternal God. But to you I make this solemn promise. I will be more helpful to you after my death than I have ever been or ever could be while still with you in this world with all its troubles. However, what happens now, I place everything in the hands of my eternal spouse, my life, my death, all that I am and all that I have. After uttering a final prayer, Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit, Catherine died surrounded by her loving Catrinati on the morning of April 29th at the age of 33. Her body was carried to the Church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, which is only a few steps away. The next day, people flooded in to bid farewell. Many of the sick were healed. Her body still rests there. Her head was brought to Siena, where her mother still lived, and was enshrined in her beloved's Basilica of San Domenico in the Chapel of St. Catherine, where it remains and continues to be reverenced by pilgrims. So who is Catherine of Siena for us today? What does she have to say to us? And what can we glean from her life as a contemplative lover, a passionate seeker of truth, a compassionate missionary of mercy, an ecclesial woman, a fearless preacher of freedom? She modeled pure and true freedom, and a tireless ambassador of peace. The central reality of Catherine's life was her intimate relationship with God. Catherine was a lover and the beloved, both a beloved daughter of the Father and Christ's mystical spouse. For Catherine, one soul is the bride of the bridegroom Christ crucified, the object of his love. There is a simplicity in Catherine's contemplative spirituality. She used many images, as though there were never enough ways to describe God's love. The Trinity is the peaceful sea in which we live. From the dialogue, I am a peaceful sea with which the soul becomes so united that she knows no movement except in me. The soul takes her rest in me, the peaceful sea. Her heart is united with me in affectionate love. You, eternal sea, you, eternal Trinity, are a deep sea. The more I enter you, the more I discover, and the more I discover, the more I seek you. Such an intimate relationship. God is closer to us than the fish is to water. Just as the sea is in the fish and the fish is in the sea, God is in us and we are in God. She describes God as drunk with love, infatuated with us. Oh, ineffable love, you kept your eye on the beauty of your creature with whom you had fallen in love, like one drunk and crazy with love. Catherine kind of babbles on. It's a sign that she was sure she was being listened to by God with tender love and mercy. She just goes on and on in her writing. She cannot say too much. We too are called to embrace this intimate friendship with God, a friendship that is inextricably bound to love of neighbor. For Catherine, truth boils down to one thing: God's wildly compassionate love for us. We stand in God's mercy. Christ's redeeming love was her truth. She spent her life seeking to walk that path of truth. Oh, eternal truth, what is your teaching? And what is the way by which you want us to go to the Father? The way by which we must go. I know of no other road but the one you paved with the true and solid virtues of your charity's fire. You, eternal word, cemented it with your blood. So this must be the road. Oh, immeasurable love, show me what people must do to keep the way of your truth. The truth Catherine wrote about was a truth she lived, not abstractions. She is still preaching this truth to all who need to hear it. Catherine, the compassionate missionary of mercy. While truth was always a top priority, Catherine's words were never dry or academic. They were on fire and explosive in their impact. In Catherine, truth exploded into a mission of compassion to bring God's love and mercy to everyone. She went to prisons and cared for the poor and the sick, often those with conditions others avoided, like the bubonic plague and leprosy. We have many accounts of that. Her compassion for sinners threw her into circumstances that were dangerous and often led into misinterpretation and attacks on her, as with the condemned revolutionary Niccolo de Toldo. She confronted political leaders who were exploiting their constituencies, reprimanding them for their unjust, selfish behavior, and calling them to justice seasoned with mercy. Even when confronting those she sought to bring to repentance or reform, she was always a messenger of compassion and love. Catherine, the ecclesial woman, the woman of the church. Catherine took on the daunting task of reforming the church. Even with the onset of the Western Schism, she never gave up hope on the church. As Don Gerget has pointed out, her capacity to love the church was equaled only by her capacity to challenge the church. The notion of reform and renewal was fundamental to her vision of the church. With her obvious holiness and moral authority, she became an unofficial conscience of the church of her time. Calling out ecclesiastical misuse of status and power, she spoke truth to power courageously and honestly, while always maintaining her compassion for those who were in error. She was a true ecclesial woman, recognized as a doctor of the church. Paul VI cites her lucid and profound understanding of truth. Like Catherine, as Dominicans, we too are called to address the needs of our church and our world with compassion, even as we challenge injustices. Often these days, like Catherine, through letter writing. Catherine, the fearless preacher of freedom. Catherine was dazzling in her freedom. Freedom to think, freedom to act, freedom to speak, a freedom that preached to all who encountered her. She embodied and preached the freedom that comes from trusting God, free from the fear of judgment of others, from the fear of failure, from the fear of weakness or inadequacy. She was steadfast in her mission to lead people from fear into freedom. It was her complete trust in God's love that gave her the strength to do tasks and pursue goals that were beyond daunting. Irish theologian and poet Paul Murray points out that Catherine's freedom led her to praise, participating fully in the celebration of the divine office, which was not permitted for laypersons, but she did it. To bless, calling down God's mercy on common criminals, sometimes bordering on an absolution, and to preach, breaking free of restrictions and speaking publicly with both confidence and humility. The Dominican motto, to praise, to bless, to preach. Catherine embodied it with her freedom. Catherine was not one to hold back. She let no one stand in her way. She was pushing boundaries, and including the restrictions on women's public roles in her day. She embraced her call as preacher and reconciler. She used her gift of exhortation in personal conversations, letter writing, and high-level political negotiations. She accepted the role of challenging popes with a strong, but always compassionate and sometimes consoling voice. She spoke bluntly to the members of the hierarchy about the state of the church. In a letter to a cardinal, she wrote, "Be silent no longer. Cry out with 100,000 voices. I see that the world is destroyed through silence. Christ's spouse, the church, is pallid. Her color has been drained from her. She is begging the cardinal to take a stand and to speak out against what was going on." Very strong words. Her unrelenting courage earned high praise even from Pope Urban, whom she was often a thorn in his side. He said, "It is we who play the coward while undaunted. She shares with us her own courageous spirit." Catherine, the tireless ambassador of peace. Catherine was a diplomatic mediator, tireless in her efforts to bring healing and reconciliation. She admonished those in authority, whether civil or ecclesiastical, to conduct their affairs with justice and mercy. Of course, for Catherine, peace meant, above all, healing and reconciliation for the church and the end to the Western schism. She called the church to be who it is, the one body of Christ, unity, to be the mystery of God's mercy. So what might we glean from these attributes as Dominican women of the 21st century? I think Catherine would say to us, attend to our world's needs with passion and always peacefully. Speak truth and always do so in love. Be fearless in speaking the truth. Don't let your shyness or fear of inadequacy or any other reason cause you to hesitate. Be ambassadors of peace in all situations. Build bridges. Be open to both sides in compassion. Be there for others. Give them the help they need in their own situations, especially those whom the world rejects, but whom God loves so much. As you might guess, there is so much more to be said about Catherine. This was only an introduction. We did not really have time to explore her writing, but I thought we might end with one of her images and one of her prayers. It's the bridge between heaven and earth, protecting us from the raging waters and stormy seas of this world. Our Irish Dominican sister Mary O'Driscoll reminds us that Catherine speaks of Jesus Christ as a bridge, emphasizing this bridge has a roof of walls and walls of mercy. Medieval bridges had walls and a roof, and even shops to offer food to travelers. Once we are on this bridge, we are completely covered and sheltered by God's mercy. And so we are in the best position to become bridges of mercy for others. How desperately does our suffering universe need bridges of mercy running through it? How might we offer and even become for others warm, welcoming bridges, overflowing with compassion and love, as we all make our way over the troubled waters, the times in which we live. And now for one of her prayers. It speaks of her trust in God's love and mercy, as well as the urgency she feels about the need for the renewal of the church. Power of the eternal Father, help me. Wisdom of the Son, enlighten my eye of understanding. Tender mercy of the Holy Spirit, inflame my heart and unite it to yourself. You know how to, and you can, and you want to. So I plead with you, have mercy on the world and restore the warmth of charity and peace and unity to Holy Church. Oh me, I wish you would not delay any longer. I beg you to let your infinite goodness force you not to close the eye of your mercy. Gentle Jesus, Jesus love. I think the line, you know how to, and you can, and you want to. It captures so beautifully Catherine's trust and total dependence on God's mercy and love. So we end our time with Catherine, patroness of Rome, memorialized by the famous Messina sculpture that stands on the grounds of Castle San Angelo, just down the boulevard leading to St. Peter's Square. A perfect way to envision this hallowed Dominican woman of the church in the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica. I want to leave you with an excerpt from one of Catherine's prayers. I don't think it needs any commentary from me. In your nature, eternal God, I shall come to know my nature. And what is my nature, boundless love? It is fire, because you are nothing but a fire of love. And you have given humankind a share in this nature, for by the fire of love you created us. And so with all other people and every created thing, you made them out of love. Thank you for tuning in today. May Catherine be our guide as we seek to claim our nature as the fire of God's love.
We thank Sister Margaret Palliser for this thoughtful conversation and helping to bring Catherine to life for us today, giving us a glimpse into who she was, who she is, and what she might like to say to us now. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a good day.